verse 6. And Judah take a wife for his firstborn, and the name was Tamar. Okay, so here, for the firstborn at least, Judah's taking responsibility. He was the one naming it, so he is now taking again. Maybe it more, well, maybe because of the eldest son, whatever. But at least he's doing here what Isaac didn't do for his father, but which Abram did for his grandfather, and that is finding a wife for his son, and her name was Tamar. Okay, so now we're going to learn. So Tamar is going to be one of the women that's mentioned, one of the 4 women that's mentioned in the light of Jesus, and so Tamar is going to kind of play the role of a prostitute, right? And she is not a Jew either. So we're going to see that later on. We'll get back to that as well. The fact that the woman that's mentioned, Bathsheba, for example, they are not, well, there were a lot of sexual sins involved with them, okay? And that a lot of them were like foreign, okay? Like Ruth as well. They're outside the line. They're not Jews per se, and that they've been prostituted or abused in a sexual way as well by so it kind of, yeah, it's interesting for the fact that these kind of women are mentioned in Jesus' line, and that they are in the line, and again it just shows God's grace. It's not only the women who are, but the men who took them, the men who abused them. I mean, it's not Bathsheba that's going to be the wrong one, that's David that's the wrong one, okay? Now, in Ruth's case, sure, there's a little bit of difference in the sense that no one there is really in the wrong. Actually, she is very much in the right and leaving her gods behind to follow the God of Israel. But we will get as well to that. Okay? So Tamar, there's another one. The first one, I mean, understandably there's Eve, but when we get to this line, then Tamar is kind of the first one mentioned of these women. I mean, sure, there's Sarah and there's Rachel and Rebecca and Rachel, you know. But later on, when the line of Jesus mentioned, then the other 4 is mentioned, and not so much the others, Sarah and all of those, all of them. Verse 7. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. So here we have a problem that was, I mean, everyone is a sinner, we know that. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3 verse 23. So we're all sinners. We're all gone astray. In the Psalms, Romans again mentioned. We're all gone astray. There is no one that doesn't sin. So it's not a question that the others were not sinners and therefore they stayed alive, kind of, and he just sinned and therefore, no, there was some egregious sin. In other words, very bad sin involved here. Exactly what it is, we don't know. It might have been kind of the same thing Onan did. We don't know what it is, but what it is, he went against God's law, and God told him to be faithful, multiply, most likely not doing it, and therefore for that reason then he was put to death. I mean, there are lots of, does God need to come down with the sword and stab him with the sword or a knife or something like that to put him to death? I mean, because of then there are so many sicknesses around. There's so many, I mean, people die of heart attacks when they're in the 30s or even younger. Even very healthy people on the football field run around and then they get a heart attack and just die down there. Recently, I think a 38-year-old South African who played for the Springboks died as well, I mean, of heart attack. So there's lots of ways how we can die because of sin, ultimately. Right, so it's not to say that God put him to death, and just ultimately what God did is he took his hand of protection of him and let sin do its job. And sin did its job and he died. Okay? But since God's the one who took it, it's shown that because of his sin, then ultimately the reason he died young was because of his sin. Now that is ultimately as well what people believe. People believe that if you die young, like here, it is because of sin. Right, so you're a sinner, so therefore, so you're a bad sinner, and therefore, like, you know, go read the book of Job. Even in John, when about the blind man and the disciples still asking Jesus, whose son was it? This guy's or his parents or whatever. So yes, this was the ultimate, and this is how they saw. You die old age, you were faithful. You die young, you were a sinner. And he died young, therefore the logical conclusion from their side, God killed him off, and it's mentioned like this. Okay, verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. So by law, Levirate law, so the second oldest or eldest, depending on which English you are using, now need to go and marry the widow and bring forth offspring. So the first son would be the offspring, then the second would be his offspring, but the first would be the offspring of his brother. And now seemingly Onan didn't want that. This was what he was supposed to do, and this is not what he wants to do. It's kind of an interesting story in that, in a certain sense, this is going to lead as well to a question of the Pharisees from Jesus about the story of the Sadducees, not the Pharisees, the Sadducees who didn't believe in life after death, resurrection that is. They're going to ask Jesus about the story of the one man with the 7 sons, and the first got married and he died, and the second married, and whose wife will she be ultimately, kind of, right? So here we have at least she is going to go through 2, and then through the father as well. So that kind of thing happened, real. So whose wife? And then understand when Jesus said, but she's going to be neither his wife, because it's not how it works in heaven or in the after death. Okay, so this is what he's supposed to do, verse 9. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the seed in the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. Okay, so I don't want to go into too much detail here about exactly what he did. I think for those grown-ups, you kind of know and understand what the heck is going on here. But he made it impossible for her to get pregnant, because the eggs and the semen, the cells need to combine, the sperm and the egg cell, and so if the sperm doesn't go in, then ultimately, though they won't combine, and she won't be able to get pregnant. And this is what he did here. And yes, the name Onan became as well a word that even today, we use for certain actions that men perform. Okay. And so his reason ultimately was, he's not going to be my offspring, or he at least, the oldest, not going to be my offspring. So I don't want to work for someone else. I don't want to spend my whole life and my line kind of dies out. And so anyhow, he did not want this. He was very selfish then. This is a law. He didn't follow the law of the people, but he broke God's law as well, because, as I mentioned earlier in this chapter, that God's law was you be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So if he did what he did, then they can't be fruitful and multiplying, because they're not having any children. And so he's not only breaking their cultural law, but he's breaking God's law as well, which makes it double worse. So the same thing that happened ultimately to his brother is going to happen to him. Verse 10, and what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So yeah, like I said, already mentioned. Okay, so he broke God's law, and it was wicked. Sure, if you go against God, it is wicked. God made you, God owes you, you belong to him, you are his son. Right? If you as a son don't follow what your parents tell you to do, especially when you live still in the house, then you ought to get ought to be disciplined and get a good hiding or something like that. Okay, don't hide people. Give a good hiding or something like that. That's old ways kind of thing. I think if more kids would get it, it might be a better understanding. Not in anger and not never overboard. Okay, that is wrong. That is illegal, and it is wrong. Doesn't matter what the government say, whatever. That's wrong. You don't, in anger, never hit someone or your child and discipline him. And you don't overdo it, right? There are ways of doing it, but good hidings can have a good effect. So he ought to follow God's law. He didn't. He broke And so he died. He died young as well. So therefore, again, the people logically will draw the conclusion, since he died young, he was a sinner, therefore. But in this case, we clearly see the reason why, because of this act of his, not wanting to have the offspring, therefore going against the cultural law, going against God's law. So, in other words, this is a clear indication of what his sin was like. For his brother, we don't really know. For him, we clearly know. And so, lawfully, God had all the right in the world, because we belong to him, all the right, since he was a sinner and he did this kind of sin, he went against God's law, so God had the right, to take his life. And again, God could have, he could have had a rock fall on him or something like that. He could have died just of a heart attack as well. I mean, we don't know how he died, but he died. He died young.